Volume 1 of 2, The Origins of Political Order and Political Decay. New York Times bestseller Francis Fukuyama, the author of The End of History and the Last Man. Volume 1, The Origins of Political Order from Pre-Human Times to the French Revolution. Chapter 2, The State of Nature. Philosophical discussion of the state of nature, how the contemporary life sciences shed light on human nature and hints on the biological foundations of politics. Politics among chimpanzees and other primates, such as ourselves. What aspects of human nature undergird politics, and when different parts of the world were first settled. In the Western philosophical tradition, discussions of the state of nature have been central to the understanding of justice and political order that underlies modern liberal democracy. Classical political philosophy distinguished between nature and convention, or that of law, i.e., Plato and Aristotle argued that a just city had to exist in conformity with man's permanent nature and not what was ephemeral and changing. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau developed this distinction later and wrote treatises on the question of the state of nature, seeking to ground political rights in it. Describing the state of nature was a means and a metaphor for discussing human nature, an exercise that would establish a hierarchy of human goods that political society was meant to foster. Aristotle differed from that of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau in one critical respect. He argued that human beings are political by nature and that their natural capacities incline them to flourish in society. The three early modern philosophers, by contrast, argued that human beings are not naturally social, but that society is a kind of artifice that allows people to achieve what they cannot get on their own. Hobbes's Leviathan begins with an extended catalog of natural human passions and argues that the deepest and most abiding one is the fear of violent death. From this, he derives the fundamental right of nature, which is the liberty each man has to preserve his own life. Human nature also provides three causes of quarrel: competition, diffidence or fear, and glory. The first makes men invade for gain, the second for safety, the third for reputation. The state of nature is thus characterized by every man against every man. To escape from this perilous situations, human beings agree to give up their natural liberty to do as they please in return for other people respecting their right to life. The state, or Leviathan, enforces these reciprocal commitments in the form of a social contract by which human beings protect those rights which they have by nature but are not able to enjoy in the state of nature due to the war of every man against every man. The government, or Leviathan, secures the right to life by securing peace. John Locke, in his second treatise on government, has a softer view of the state of nature than that of Hobbes. Human beings are less occupied fighting one another than mixing their labor with the common things of nature to produce private property. Locke's fundamental law of nature, in contrast to that of Hobbes, gives human beings the right not just to life, but to a life, health, liberty, or possessions. Unregulated liberty in the state of nature leads to the state of war, necessitating, as for Hobbes, a social contract for the preservation of natural liberty and property. Although the state, in Locke's view, is necessary, it can itself become the denier of natural rights, and so he posits a right to revolt against unjust authority. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, posited by Thomas Jefferson, our third president of the United States, in the American Declaration of Independence, traces its ancestry directly back to Hobbes's right of nature, via Locke's amendment concerning the danger of tyranny. Hobbes's violent state of nature, wherein the life of man is famously solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, is traditionally contrasted with Rousseau's more peaceful version given in his discourse on the origin and the foundation of inequality among mankind. Indeed, Rousseau explicitly criticizes Hobbes at several points. Quote, But above all things, let us be aware, concluding with Hobbes, that man, as having no idea of goodness, must be naturally bad, that he is vicious because he does not know what virtue is, that he always refuses to do any service to those of his own species, because he believes that none is due to them, that in virtue of that right which he justly claims to everything he wants, he foolishly looks upon himself as proprietor of the whole universe. End quote. Rousseau argues that Hobbes has not in fact uncovered natural man. The violent creature described in Leviathan is actually the product of the contaminating effects of centuries of social development. Natural human beings, for Rousseau, are indeed solitary, but they are also timid, fearful, and more likely to flee one another than to fight. Savage man's, quote, desires never extend beyond his physical wants. He knows no goods but food, a female, and rest, end quote. He fears pain and hunger, but not the abstraction of death. Thus, the rise of political society does not represent salvation from the war of every man against himself, or against every man, but a bondage to other human beings through ties of mutual dependence. Rousseau says at the beginning of the Discourse on Inequality that, quote, the researches in which we may engage on this occasion are not to be taken for historical truths, but merely as hypothetical and conditional reasonings, fitter to illustrate the nature of things than to show their true origin, end quote. For Rousseau and Hobbes, the state of nature was less a historical account than a heuristic device for uncovering human nature. That is, the deepest and most abiding characteristics of human beings, when shorn of behaviors brought about by civilization and history. Yet, the intention of Rousseau's discourse is clearly to provide a developmental account of human behavior. He talks about man's perfectibility and speculates on how human thoughts, passions, and behavior have evolved or changed over time. He adduces considerable evidence about indigenous peoples of the New World, for example, as well as arguments based on observations of animalistic behavior to try to understand what is human by nature and what is human by social conventionality. It is always risky to think one understands the true intentions of great thinkers, but given the foundational importance of the accounts of the state of nature offered by Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau to Western political self-understanding, it is not unfair to contrast them with what we naturally or actually know today about human origins as a result of recent advances in a range of life sciences. The knowledge exists in several distinct domains, including primatology, population genetics, archaeology, social anthropology, and of course, the overarching framework of evolutionary biology. We can rerun Rousseau's thought experiments using much better empirical data, and what we find confirms certain of his insights while throwing others into question. The recovery of human nature by modern biology, in any case, is extremely pertinent as a foundation for any theory of political development, because it provides us with the basic building blocks by which we can understand the later evolution of human institutions. Rousseau was brilliantly correct in certain of his observations, such as his view that human inequality had its origins in the development of metallurgy, agriculture, and above all, private property. But he, Hobbes, and Locke were among many who were wrong on one of very important points. All three thinkers saw human beings in the state of nature as isolated individuals, for whom society was not natural. According to Hobbes, early human beings relate to one another primarily through fear, envy, and conflict. Rousseau's primitive human of greed is even more isolated. While sex is natural, the family is not. Mutual human dependence comes about almost accidentally as a result of technological innovations like agriculture that require greater cooperation. For both, human society emerged only with the passage of historical time and involves compromises of natural liberty. This is not the way things actually happened. In his 1861 book, Ancient Law, the English legal scholar Henry Maine criticizes the state of nature theorists in the following terms, quote, "Yet these two theories of Hobbes and Locke, which long divided the reflecting politicians of England into hostile camps, resemble each other strictly in their fundamental assumption of a non-historic, unverifiable condition of the race. Their authors differed as to the characteristics of the pre-social state, and as to the nature of the abnormal action by which men lifted themselves out of it into that social organization with which alone we are acquainted. But they agreed in thinking that a great chasm separated man in his primitive condition from man in society. End quote. And so here we see people in historical times seeing man as a historical being, not truly understanding the primitive nature of mankind in prehistory. And so we might label this Hobbesian fallacy, the idea that human beings were primordially individualistic, and that they entered into society at a later stage in their development only as a result of a rational calculation that social cooperation was the best way for them to achieve their individual ends. This premise of primordial individualism underpins the understanding of rights contained in the American Declaration of Independence, and thus of the democratic political community that springs from it. This premise also underlies contemporary neoclassical economics, which builds its models on the assumption that human beings are rational beings who want to maximize their individual utility or incomes. But it is, in fact, individualism and not sociability that developed over the course of human history. That individualism seems today like a solid core of our economic and political behavior, and it is only because we have developed institutions that override our more naturally communal instincts. Aristotle was more correct than these early modern liberal theorists of the Enlightenment era when he said that human beings were political by nature. And so while an individualistic understanding of motivation may help to explain the activities of commodity traders and libertarian activists in present-day America, it is not the most helpful way to understand the early evolution of human politics. And obviously, Hobbes was writing in the 16th century, and so we've came a long way from that point in time. Everything that modern biology and anthropology tell us about the state of nature suggests the opposite. There was never a period in human evolution when human beings existed as isolated individuals. The primate precursors of the human species and genus had already developed extensive social and indeed political skills. The human brain is hardwired with faculties that facilitate many forms of social cooperation. The state of nature might be characterized as a state of war, since violence was endemic, but the violence was not perpetuated by individuals so much as by tightly bonded social groups. And of course, we're thinking of tribes, and thinking of bands. Human beings do not enter into society and political life as a result of conscious, rational decision. Communal organization comes to them naturally through the specific ways that they cooperate, and that is shaped by their environment, ideas, and culture. Indeed, the most basic forms of cooperation predate the emergence of human beings by millions of years. Biologists have identified two natural sources of cooperative behavior: kin selection and reciprocal altruism. With regard to the first, that of kin selection, the name of the game in biological evolution is not the survival of a given organism, but the survival of that organism's genes. This produces a regularity that was formulated by the biologist William Hamilton as the principle of inclusive fitness or kin selection, which holds that individuals of any sexually reproducing species will behave altruistically toward kin in proportion to the number of genes that they share. Parents and children and brothers and sisters share 50% of their genes, and so will behave more altruistically toward each other than toward first cousins, for example, who share only 25%. And of course, that's why you're less likely to kill your parents than you are your cousins. However, this behavior has been observed in species ranging from ground squirrels, which discriminate between full and half-sisters in nesting behavior, to human beings for whom nepotism is not only a socially but a biologically grounded reality. The desire to pass resources on to kin is one of the most enduring constants in human politics. The ability to cooperate with genetic strangers is referred to by biologists as reciprocal altruism. And in addition to kin selection is the second major biological source of social behavior found in many species of animals. Social cooperation depends on an individual's ability to solve what game theorists label repeated prisoner's dilemma games. In these games, individuals potentially benefit by being able to work together, but they can often benefit more if they let other individuals do the cooperating and free ride off of their efforts. In the 1980s, the political scientist Robert Axelrod staged a tournament of computer programs that mechanically implemented strategies for solving repeated prisoners' dilemmas games. The winning strategy was called tit for tat, in which a player reciprocated cooperation if the other player had cooperated in an earlier game, but refused to cooperate with the player who had failed to cooperate previously. Axelrod demonstrated that a form of morality could evolve spontaneously as a rational decision maker or decision makers interact with one another over time, even though motivated in the first instance by nothing more than self-interest. Reciprocal altruism occurs in a wide variety of species beside human beings. Vampire bats and baboons have been observed feeding and protecting offspring within a colony, not their own. While in some cases, like cleaner fish and the fish they clean, bonds of reciprocity exist between completely different species. The interactions between dogs and human beings suggests a similar set of evolved behaviors on the part of both species. Chimpanzee politics and its relevance to human political development. Evolutionary biology provides the broad framework for understanding how the human species evolved from primate predecessors. We know that both human beings and modern chimps are descended from a common chimp-like ancestor, with humans branching off approximately 5 million years ago. The human and chimp genomes overlap by some 99 percentile, matching each other more closely than any other pair of primates. That diverging 1% accounts for language, religion, abstract thought, and the like, not to speak of certain significant anatomical or physiological differences. However, so it is rather important. We of course have no way of studying the behavior of the common chimp-human ancestor, but primatologists have spent a great deal of time observing the behavior of chimps and other primates, both in their natural habitats and in zoos, behavior that reveals striking continuities with that of human beings. The biological anthropologist Richard Wrangham, in his book Demonic Males, describes groups of male chimps in the wild ranging beyond their territories to attack and kill chimps from neighboring communities. These males cooperate with one another to stalk, surround, and then kill an isolated neighbor, and then go on to eliminate all of the other males in the colony. The females are then captured and incorporated into the raiding chimps group. This is very similar to the kind of raiding done by human males in places like New Guinea highlands and or among the Yamamoto Indians observed by the anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon. According to Wrangham, quote, very few animals live in patrilineal male-bonded communities where females routinely reduce the risk of inbreeding by moving to neighboring groups to mate, and only 2 animal species are known to do so with a system of intense male-initiated territorial aggression, including lethal raiding into neighboring communities in search of vulnerable enemies to attack and kill, end quote. These 2 species are chimps and human beings. According to the archaeologist Stephen LeBlanc, quote, much of the non-complex society that human warfare is similar to chimpanzee attacks, massacres among humans that social level are in fact rare occurrences, and victory by attrition is a viable strategy, as are buffer zones, surprise raids, taking captive females into the group, and mutilation of victims. The chimp and human behaviors are almost completely parallel." End quote. The primary difference is that human beings are more deadly because they are able to use a wider and more lethal suite of weapons. Chimpanzees defend their ranges like human groups do, but in other respects they are very different. Males and females do not come together in families to raise children. They create separate male and female hierarchies. The politics of dominance within those hierarchies, however, is reminiscent of politics within human groups. An alpha male in a chimp colony is not born to that status. Like the big man in Melanesian society, he has to earn it by building coalitions of supporters. While physical size and strength matter, dominance is ultimately achieved through an ability to cooperate with others. The primatologist Frans de Waal, observing a colony of captive chimps in the Arnhem Zoo in the Netherlands, describes an older alpha male being displaced from his position by an alliance of two younger chimps. No sooner had one of the usurpers achieved alpha male status than he turned on his erstwhile ally and eventually murdered him. Of course, when male or female chimps have achieved dominance within their respective hierarchies, they exercise what can only be described as authority, or the ability to settle conflicts and set rules based on their status within that hierarchy. Chimps recognize authority through a submissive greeting, a series of short grunts followed by deep bows, and the holding out of a hand to the superior, and kissing of the feet. De Waal describes a dominant female chimp named Mama, whom he compares to a grandmother in a Spanish or Chinese family. Quote, "When tensions in the group reach their peak, the combatants always turn to her, even the adult males. Many a time I have seen a major conflict between two males end up in her arms. Instead of resorting to physical violence at the climax of the confrontation, the rivals run to Mama, screaming loudly." End quote. Building coalitions in chimp society is not a straightforward process and requires something like an ability to judge character. Like humans, chimps are capable of deception and have to evaluate potential allies for their trustworthiness. Longtime observers of chimp behavior at Arnhem, again that's in the Netherlands, noted that each individual chimp had a distinct personality and that some were more trustworthy than others. De Waal describes a female named Pust, who was observed attacking fellows when least expected, or feigning a reconciliation only to take advantage of the other chimp's relaxed guard. And as a result of this behavior, low-ranking chimps learned to avoid her. And so chimpanzees seem to understand that there are social rules that they are expected to follow. They do not always do so, and the violation of group normalities, or the defying of authority, is accompanied by what seem to be feelings of guilt or embarrassment. De Waal described an incident in which a graduate student named Yvonne had a young chimp named Choco staying with her. Choco was becoming more and more mischievous, and it was time she checked. One day when Choco had taken the phone off the hook for the 9th time, Yvonne gave her a good scolding while at the same time gripping her arm unusually tightly. The scolding seemed to have the desired effect, so Yvonne sat down on the sofa and started to read a book. She had forgotten the whole incident when suddenly Choco leapt to her lap, threw her arms around Yvonne's neck, and gave her a typical chimpanzee kiss with an open mouth smack on the lips. De Waal notes the danger of human beings anthropomorphize the animal behavior, but the chimp's closest observers became completely convinced of the emotional undercurrents behind Choco's behavior. The relevance of chimpanzee behavior to human political development is clear. Human beings and chimpanzees were both descended from an ancestral type, and both modern chimps and human beings, especially those living in hunter-gatherer or other relatively primitive societies, display similar forms of social behavior. For the account of the state of nature given by Hobbes, Locke, or Rousseau to be correct, we would have to postulate that in the course of evolving into modern humans, our ape ancestors somehow momentarily lost their social behaviors and emotions, and then evolved them a second time at a somewhat later stage in development. It is much more plausible to assume that human beings never existed as isolated individuals, and that social bonding into kin-based groups was part of their behavior from before the time that modern humans existed. And so human sociability is not a historical or a cultural acquisition, but it is something that has been hardwired into human nature. This is part 1, and I'll probably do a part 3. I'll do a part 2 and then a part 3 for chapter 2. So it'll be 3 parts for chapter 2.